This is a picture of me with my first motorcycle. I realize that many people would say it is not a motorcycle, but to me at age 2, it most definitely was. And true, it didn't match up exactly with the thrilling machines that occasionally passed by on the street, but I understood that it was as close to a motorcycle as my parents were likely to give me. A few years later, when I was about 5, my mom read me a bedtime story about a boy who goes out into the woods and has all kinds of adventures. Early the next morning, I awoke with my heart full of a desire for adventure. So I put on my sweater, it gets cold in the woods, and I put some slices of bread into a brown paper lunch bag. I might get hungry in the woods, and I launched myself into life. The woods were at the end of the street, at the very top of a hill. I toiled up the sidewalk, clutching my sweater around me and carrying my little bag of bread. As I reached the top of the hill, almost at the end of the street, I met one of our neighbors who was out sweeping her walk. She greeted me kindly and, understandably curious, asked me where I was going. "I'm going to the woods to have adventures." She was unflappable. She said, "Oh, how nice." Then she said, pointing, "Is that your daddy out in front of your house?" I turned to look. Yes, it was my daddy standing in front of our house in his t-shirt and boxers. The kind neighbor said, "He looks worried." Yes, he did. He was glancing around anxiously, as a parent might after waking up to discover that the 5-year-old was missing. The neighbor said, "Do you think you should go and tell him that you're all right?" My shoulders sank. It was clear that my adventures in the woods would have to wait. It would be unkind to let my dad continue to worry. I had to go back and reassure him. And I knew, even though it had not previously occurred to me, that he would not let me go back up the hill and into the woods like the boy in the story. The boy. To his credit, my dad didn't focus on the boy part of my inspiration. He focused on, it was just a story, and you are a child. So for a while, society's ideas about gender remained in the background, but those ideas, nonetheless, were shaping not only me, but also our family dynamic. Just as my parents would not buy me a real motorcycle, they discouraged solo adventures. They also discouraged, with expressions of frantic concern, my predilection for shinnying up lampposts. They refused to let me take Taekwondo. When I was about 7, we moved to a house that was next to a woods. And my parents began to understand that I was going to run wildly through the trees, climb all of them, and in general, launch myself into whatever adventures were available in the neighborhood. When I was 8, they gave me what I thought of as a racing bike because it had thin tires. I rode it in an ever-increasing radius, expanding the notion of neighborhood to its limits. And there were woods all over the place. One memorable day, I persuaded an entire group of friends to run away to live in the woods. What that meant was packing snacks and sweaters, there's a pattern here, and going to one of the farther away woods and setting up camp. We talked and ate our snacks and didn't light a fire because we knew that was unwise. We whiled away the whole afternoon until, as dusk came, some of my friends began to think about going home for supper and real beds. And as several of them pointed out, our parents will worry. Yes, they would. I was acquainted with that issue. In my desire for adventures, I had an ally in my dad. I wasn't the only one who longed to go into the woods and have adventures. We went canoeing. We took family camping vacations. I learned to identify animal tracks, build a campfire safely and fully extinguish it, put up a tent and carry my own gear. Dad learned to fly a small plane, and he took me up. He learned to fly a sailplane, and he took me up. When I started playing football with the neighborhood kids, he taught me how to throw a football and to catch a bullet pass. Ouch! I learned to do it so it didn't hurt. In all of these ramblings, it made absolutely no sense to dress like a girl. My sisters loved cute shorts and matching sleeveless blouses. I had no desire to run through the woods and have brambles scratch me up. So when I played football, I wanted to be able to tackle the big kids without skinning my knees. So I wore jeans and long-sleeve denim shirts. And every Sunday, my mom struggled to get me to wear the frilly dresses and patent leather shoes she considered appropriate attire for church. She remembers the struggle to this day. A few weeks ago, as we were looking at family photos, we found a picture of my sisters and me posed in matching frilly dresses. I was about 6. As we gazed at it, my mom said, "That was before Jen started wearing only boy clothes." Only now do I have the perspective to grasp the challenges of growing up as an adventurous girl in a time and place and culture where the very term girl was expected to govern my attire, my deportment, my conversation, and my ambitions. At the age of 11, I thought I could do anything. I was interested in science and astronomy, and I dreamed of becoming an astronaut. Just a year later, I sat in a tree with one of my closest friends, Gary. We were talking about the future. I said out loud for the first time that I would like to be an astronaut, but girls couldn't be astronauts. My buddy Gary nodded in some sincere commiseration. Of course, girls couldn't be astronauts. We were both wrong, but it didn't change the reality at that moment. I was a girl. There were rules. True, there were lots of rules I could bend. There were rules I could break. There were some rules that seemed unbreakable, even though it turned out later that they were not. But these kind of rules, breakable though they may be, impose constraints that hold girls and women back, and when broken, inflict suffering by the judgment of others. They're close relatives of that other set of rules, telling boys not to play with dolls, or wear dresses, or cry, or be nurturing. The rules for boys that underpin toxic masculinity. When I was 11 and out roaming on my bicycle, I got a flat tire, and the nice gas station attendant who helped me fix it said quite kindly, "Are you a boy or a girl?" It was painful. I knew I looked like a boy. In some ways, I wanted to be a boy, to have a boy's broader range of action. But why couldn't I just be me? Why did I have to be one label or the other? Long ago, when I first read about transgender people, about young adults from the time they were children who were convinced they were born into the wrong body, I wondered if that's who I was. But I'm not in the wrong body. I'm just me. In my childhood, the clothes that shouted boy to others were a consequence of what I wanted to do. And yet, clothes are one of the most strongly coded signals of gender. And even the things I wanted to do were coded as male. All my life, I've wanted to do what I longed to do. I've never understood why anyone would say that those longings would make me other. If I were to put a label on my childhood self, I'd say I was gender nonconforming, not just in my gender expression, but in my choices about activities and how I carried myself into the world. Now, the world has changed a lot, at least for girls. In some ways, it has caught up with 2-year-old me and 5-year-old me and 11-year-old me. Women are doctors, lawyers, ministers, astronauts. They're wilderness trekkers, racing cyclists, martial artists. And I've been a lot of those. School dress codes usually allow girls to wear pants, which is helpful for girls who want to play on the monkey bars. There are many, many opportunities for girls to go into the woods and have adventures. I'm glad our culture has changed. But the freedom I now have shouldn't be only for me or only for cisgender girls and women. I don't want any of my human kindred to have to explain themselves within a gender paradigm of binary, either or. I want the world, and especially my faith community, to affirm and promote the inherent worth and dignity of every person.
When Reverend Jen asked me to do a sermon with her about transgender people, I wanted to say no. She told me Reverend Aaron said I had some interesting stories about traveling around rural Iowa and feeling unsafe as a trans person. When she said that, I felt gross and angry. Gross because I was being tokenized, reduced to my gender identity, and asked to do something for the purpose of someone else's desire to say something. And angry because it felt like it was the easy way out. We all know there are transphobic people out there. The harder conversation we need to have is about in here, in Des Moines, in our church. Reverend Jen and I ended up having a really good conversation about her invitation, which is how I ended up here today. After talking together, I realized our stories had a lot of similarities, including us both wanting to be astronauts as children. Our creative interchange helped me see that it might be worth standing up here today. Some of you may know that I hate talking about pronouns. It is such a small part of who we are as people. But since we've started putting pronouns on our name tags and putting up posters, I've been paying more attention to how people gender me at church. Some folks have gotten it right, and I thank them. And some folks, including people I'm in regular relationship with, have gotten it wrong, whether I've been wearing my name tag or not. And it hurts, because like many of us, I work hard to figure out how to articulate my gender just right. As a Nikkei person, or person of Japanese American descent, sharing my gender and moving through the world as a gendered person always feels loaded. I was at an event the other month and someone came up to my partner to say hi. They didn't know who I was, so they asked, "Is this your son?" This happens all the time. My best guess is that they saw a short, masculine person who isn't that hairy or muscular and came to what they felt like was the only logical conclusion, that I'm a young boy. These interactions around gender hurt because they are also complicated by race. In the case of assuming I'm my spouse's son, it's important to know that my spouse is white. It's much less common to see an East Asian man with a white woman. When people make this mistake, I feel the impact of the long history of Asian men being portrayed as weak and sexually undesirable in this country. In the times that I'm misgendered as female, I'm reminded of how Asian men in America are labeled feminine because of our historical association with doing women's work, like laundry, cooking, and cleaning, and with an interpretation of Asian culture itself as feminine. Kimono-style jackets are a great example. How often do you see white men in those if they aren't dressed up in costume? These situations leave me in a predicament. If I don't look masculine, and I have a long-standing racial assumption stacked against me, how else can I express my gender to others? What option is left besides being a jerk, taking up space, talking over others, and generally trying to dominate? But that doesn't really align with my values either. But I look inside myself to see what I'm doing wrong, what I can do differently, because it's terrible to feel powerless. Because what I'm up against are the ways that we've been taught to understand and enforce gender. In most scenarios, I'm boxed in as one gender or another. My trans history and gender complexity are completely erased. And this makes it hard for me to feel comfortable in my body around other people. I can share my pronouns from here until eternity, but unless we begin to examine how we're taught to understand gender, I don't think things are going to change. So I'm going to issue you a challenge today. As a prophetic voice from the margins, I'm going to challenge you to stop assuming you can tell a person's gender just by looking at them. In many gender workshops, we are being taught to view gender as a spectrum. The problem with that model is that it still assumes a shared definition of masculinity and femininity, and that the two are opposites. What I want to ask of you instead is to consider the metaphor of a constellation. See, I love space, and constellations are something that I've spent a lot of time reading about and studying. Constellations are cultural stories. When some people look up at the night sky, they see stars that look like a bear. Other people look at the same stars and they see a dipper. People in yet other cultures may see a wall guarding a castle or a coffin with a trail of mourners. Before any of us are taught these stories, we might see nothing but points of light in the sky. Each arrangement is given meaning by the culture it comes from and how that culture uses those stories to understand and bring order to their lives. It's okay to tell different stories about the same thing, and I think, in fact, it's great if we tell multiple stories, because then these stories don't become boxes that we try to fit everyone into. Instead, we can view them as an opportunity to see into another perspective, another set of cultural values, and to make the circle of what we don't know about the world a little bit smaller. So, how do we approach gender together? I believe you can only know my gender and what that means to me through being in relationship with me and believing me when I tell you what my gender is. I'm not a woman you call he. I am he. And I want you to call me that every single time. Even if what he means to me is the same thing as what she or they means to someone else. Because every time you call me by a pronoun that isn't my own, it means you don't believe I am who I say I am. And that makes it harder for us to form a relationship where we can both share about all the other things in life that matter to us, which I think is ultimately the point of spiritual community. So for the sake of us all, let's be open to a different story or different stories. Let's fight against the ways we've been conditioned from a young age to segregate by gender, to live up to different gender roles, and to expect different treatment based on what others assume our gender to be. Because that's the beginning of how we ally with transgender people and make gender justice a little bit more possible for everybody. Thank you.